Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Sunday, August 29th episode of Poets and Muses, where we chat with poets about their inspirations. I'm your host, Imogen A-Rate. You can find us at poetsandmuses.com as well as on Instagram and Twitter under Poets and Muses. You can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter at poetsandmuses.com. Now, in addition to the Poets and Muses website and SoundCloud page, you can also listen to the Poets and Muses podcast on your preferred podcast platforms. Earlier this week, we received the incredibly sad news that one of our earliest featured poets, Dallas Summers, had lost his life last Sunday. For those who are familiar with Dallas and know of his presence on the Phoenix metro area community poetry scene, and would like to pay their respects. His family had posted some information about the viewing as well as services for Dallas, which will take place on September 3rd and 4th. And you can find out more information at facebook.com/events/383-049-300-198-955. Again, that's at facebook.com/events/383-049-300-198-955. I believe it is possible to attend the service virtually in case you are located further afield. You can also help the Dallas family with their efforts to fly into Arizona to attend the service. There is a GoFundMe set up you can look for. Help Dallas family fly down to Arizona. Again, that's help Dallas family fly down to Arizona. Today, our featured poet of the week is Aaron Caicedo Kimura, with whom I will be discussing his poem, Screaming Crows, and my poem, Eliminating Temptations. Before we do that, I'm going to go over some virtual poetry events taking place during the week of August 30th. Aside from the weekly events I usually announce, this week on Tuesday, August 31st, from 7:30 p.m. British time, Dead Women's Poets Society will be hosting their Not in Halifax seance with Genevieve L. Walsh and Charlotte Wetton. You can find out more information at deadwomenpoets.com/events. Again, that's deadwomenpoets.com/events. From 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the Writers Center will be hosting their curated conversations with Sarah Lupita Oliveras and Ileana Rocha. You can find out more information at writer.org/reading-events. Again, that's writer.org/reading-events. On Wednesday, September 1st, from 6 p.m. Amsterdam time, I believe Word Up Amsterdam will be returning with their weekly Inspiration Factory writing workshop by Janice. You can double check at wordupamsterdam.weebly.com/workshops.html. Again, that's at wordupamsterdam.weebly.com/workshops.html. On Thursday, September 2nd, from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. Central Daylight Time, True Art Speaks will be hosting their Echo Monthly Writing Circle. It's gone back to physical events, but I believe they're offering a virtual option as well. You can double check at trueartspeaks.org/events. Again, that's at trueartspeaks.org/events. True is spelled TRU. On Sunday, September 5th, from 5 to 7 p.m. British time, Poetry LGBT will be hosting their monthly open mic. You can find out more information at Poetry LGBT on Instagram. Again, that's at Poetry LGBT on Instagram. from 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Poets in Pajamas will be hosting their reading with our past poet guest, Oscar Mencinas, with a Q&A afterwards. You can find out more information at facebook.com/events/225-444-009-263-222. Again, that's at facebook.com/225-444-009-263-222. And now let us welcome our poet guest of the week, Aaron Casedo Kimura. Hi, Aaron. Thank you very much for coming on to Poets and Muses.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Me too. I'm really glad to have you on. So you brought with you your poem, Screaming Crows. Before we get into that, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, Aaron.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I was born and grew up in California. I'm from the West Coast, in the city of Santa Rosa. So I'm from suburbia. I did my first round of post-secondary education in music. I did my undergrad at the Conservatory in San Francisco. I studied symphonic percussion performance. And then for my grad school, I came out to New York City. I came out to the East Coast. And I've never returned to live in the West Coast. I'm here in Connecticut now, where I live with my wife. So I did my first round of education in music. But during my graduate school, I realized that I really didn't love it. I love music, but I didn't love performing music, and it wasn't something that I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I think it wasn't something that was in my heart. It wasn't a passion. And so after I graduated, I did some soul searching and realized that I had always been more visually oriented than orally. So I picked up computer graphics on my own to pay the bills, and I like say I picked up a paintbrush to feed my soul. Poetry didn't come into the picture until many, many years later. How I got to poetry is like this. My wife was a lawyer. She discovered that she really didn't like being a lawyer. She liked the mental exercise, but she really didn't like the practice of it. She wanted to be a writer. So she quit the law profession and decided to go back to school. She wanted to be a fiction writer originally, but all the fiction classes were filled up. There was a poetry class that she could get into. And I knew back then that that was the right class for her. She's such a words person. She took this poetry class and she started writing poetry and showing me her drafts, asking me what I thought of them. And I didn't have a clue. I didn't know anything about poetry. So I thought, okay, maybe if I study on my own and write my own poetry, maybe I could give her some reasonable feedback. And also around this time, she started dragging me to all these poetry readings. And how can you not go home after all that inspiration and try to write something of your own?
Oh, yes.
And that was around 2009, 2010.
Oh, wow.
We've been married 23 years. And when we first got married, poetry was nowhere on the radar. So it's been really wonderful to discover this art together. Well, my wife first, and then I followed in her footsteps. And in 2013, she applied for and was accepted into the MFA program at Boston University. So we moved from Connecticut to Boston, and that's when I started becoming a little more serious about writing poetry. She would come home and would say, you know, this teacher said this, and I would write it down and apply it to my work. But it wasn't until 6 years later that I applied for the program and went through it as well and got my MFA. So even though I'm an older guy, I consider myself a very young writer. But it's been a wonderful journey, and I think poetry is good for me because of my background. You know, I have background in music, background in visual art. You know, there's sound, there's image, and you know, those two things are probably what's most important to me in poetry.
Yeah, they are. Very much so, especially in lyrical poetry, right? Narrative poetry as well. The cadence is much more oral dependent. So all the previous work you did, they were not wasted. They were just preparation for this other major part of your life.
Education, no matter what it is never wasted.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And you know what they say, as one of the ingredients for a long-lasting marriage is finding common ground, things that you can do together and love together. So it's
absolutely.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful story that you both found poetry together. I'm just like tingling from what you're telling me. It's so nice.
It's really nice to have an in-house first reader as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that you told us about how you got into poetry, which is one of the more unusual paths I've heard about, I was wondering if you remember the first poem you wrote and what it was about.
Wow. When I was a little kid, I would read poems, and I know I have a couple of those around here somewhere, but poetry wasn't taught very well when I was growing up. In general, poetry was not something that I thought was accessible to me, real poetry, and I think that's one of the big reasons why I've stayed away from poetry until now. But among the first poems that I wrote as someone who wanted to be a poet is the poem we're going to discuss today, Screaming Crows.
Oh, okay.
Wow. That was actually the first poem I ever got published.
Okay,
in
great.
2014.
Okay.
I still remember starting to work on it and write about what happens in the poem. It looks a lot different now than it did when it was published, because I've learned a lot since then. So
right. Yeah, it's nice that you go back and you edit and you apply the new knowledge that you have to an older piece. I think it's good practice for any writer. But going back to something you have mentioned previously about how when you were a child, when you encounter poetry for the first time in an academic setting, that you felt it was inaccessible to you. What was it that you found inaccessible?
I think it must have been the type of poetry that was presented to me. I don't remember what poems they were, but I remember thinking, okay, this is not interesting to me. This isn't something that's relevant to my life. I don't understand it. It was something that I felt too lofty for me. And so I never returned to it. It was something I had to do for school, and that was it. It wasn't something to be enjoyed.
Well, it's certainly not in the context of doing something enjoyable with your love, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
There's always much more motivation there.
Right.
So I think this is a great time, if you don't mind, to read your poem for us, and then we'll talk about it.
I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
The poem is entitled Screaming Crows. One tree, center of the garden, the pin oak you silently trimmed and cared for all the years we lived there. Your tree, bronchi infested with crows, multiplying so dense no wind or light could pass through. I shook the tree without knowing, heaved you onto the bed, released the scream of 1,000 crows, a cancer in midair. The battering of wings tore through my earth as your eyes swallowed mine. Dignity lost, a Nisei gardener slipped away in the echo with the wind and the light.
Thank you. This is such a moving poem. I can feel, even when I read it myself, but especially when you're reading it, the feelings behind it, that sense of inadvertently hurting someone you love,
Yeah. I always have to be careful when I read this poem. I was explaining to somebody who asked me about, in a reading I was doing, about how I share such personal things, and I have to separate myself a certain amount from my poems in order to read them.
Mm.
This poem is about the worst moment of my whole life.
Mm.
And yeah, it still is the worst moment of my whole life. Nothing else has surpassed it. And so when I read this poem, I have to read as if it did not happen to me and my father. And, it's somebody else's poem. But I'm glad the emotion does still come through.
Yes.
Hopefully it's coming through in the words. And,
it does. Yeah. Both in the words on the page as well as when you are reading it, the pauses you take, the intonation of the words. I know this is an incredibly tough subject for you. I wonder if you would be willing to tell us the story behind the poem.
Sure. My father passed away in 2011. He was 86 years old. He was a smoker when he was younger. He smoked 2 packs a day for 30 years. Wow. He quit in 1972. So I think quitting that at that point gave him many years to his life. But he eventually died from lung cancer.
Right.
He went very quickly. It only took maybe 2 months from when he started feeling uncomfortable in his body to when he passed away, which was really quick. 2 months before he died, he was up in that pin oak tree, sawing away branches and pruning that tree. My dad was a very physically strong man. He was stronger than I up until a month before he passed away. 85 years old, very strong. He was a very sturdy guy. He spent his last days in an easy chair next to his bed. We thought that maybe toward the end there, he would be more comfortable in a hospital bed. So we got him a hospital bed. This is in California. I flew out to be with him. I feel so fortunate that I was able to be with my father when he passed away, and my mother as well, 4 years later. I consider that such a gift that, I could be there right with him. So we got him a hospital bed. I lifted him from his chair, his easy chair, into the bed. But, we didn't know exactly how bad the cancer was, what it was doing inside of him. Partly, I think that was his primary care physician's fault. Didn't catch it. So by the time that he referred my father to the oncologist, I think the oncologist assumed that we knew that it was bad and he was a goner, that he would die soon. But we really didn't know. So, yeah, when I lifted him, I think I just really crushed his lungs or something. It was horrible. And my father, I'm such a huge introvert. My dad was way off the charts in introversion. He was a very quiet man. And he let out this scream that, it was awful. And looking right into my eyes, since I was lifting him face to face. Right. And so that's the moment that I tried to capture with this poem.
Right. I'm so sorry that you had that experience, especially since obviously you wanted to give him the kind of care that would extend his life, that would ameliorate his health.
Yeah, it was awful.
Yeah,
I felt very bad for a long time after that. I mean, even we knew that he was going to die in the next day or so, or that day he was close.
At the same time, I feel like even though he obviously felt this pain that was inadvertently caused by moving him onto the bed. I think him knowing you as long as he has known you all of your life, that he must have known that you meant well and the pain was entirely accidental.
Yeah. I'd like to think so.
Yeah. Obviously, in both you're relating the story to the readers through this poem and in your own mind, because maybe you never got a chance to talk about it. I still think you also know your father for as long as you did, right? Decades. So you must have known that he understood your intentions.
Yes.
That's good. Yeah, because I think with the timing that it would be terrible for you to be unfairly burdened with that for the rest of your life.
Yes. Yeah, knowing my father, I know he would never hold that against me. And I expressed my concern to my mom at what I had done. And, she also didn't hold that against me. Right. So, yeah, I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. I think as children, especially from Asian American cultures, I think sometimes we cannot help but be our worst critics.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that with the writing of this poem that there was some sense of relief that this served as somewhat of a confessional purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really got it off my chest. And this poem is from my chapbook, my new chapbook, Ubasute. And there's another poem in there that also deals with this topic, When You're the Sun. Yeah, I think it was necessary for me to write those poems and to get them out there. And yeah.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit more about the chapbook?
Oh, sure. I'd love to. Sure. Yeah, it's a new chapbook, and the title of the book is Ubasute, and the book is about my parents, and it covers their experiences in World War II, of being parents, of being newlyweds, of settling in suburbia, and mostly of growing old and dying. The title, Ubasute, it's a Japanese word which literally means abandoned. And it refers to this mythical custom, this mythical practice where a grown son, carries his parent, father or mother, to a mountain and abandons them there and leaves them there to die. And this was a horrible tale that my mother told me when I was a little boy. So I have two poems in the book that deal with this, the first one and the last one. I remember when my mother told me this, I thought it was the most horrible thing. Well, the first thing I thought was actually, how am I going to lift my mother on my back? As a little kid. And my mother, even though she was probably only 4 feet tall, 100 pounds, still she was big when I was a little boy. And so I thought, okay, how am I going to do this? How am I going to carry her all the way to a mountain? But then the second thought was, how horrible this is. I could never do this to my mother. And so, yeah, the book is, as I said, I was able to be there for both my mother and my father when they were dying and finally passed away. And I feel so fortunate that I was able to do that for them, to just be there for them. They both wanted to die at home, family around them, and that's what they got, And so, yeah, this book is largely about them growing old and passing away. I wrote these poems. Well, one reason I wrote these poems is because my father wrote my sister and me a letter saying that he wanted to be cremated. He didn't want us to have a funeral, a memorial service. He didn't want us to put an obituary in the newspaper. Okay. And then 4 years later, my mom asked the same thing. You know, as dutiful Asian children, of course, we had to honor their wishes. But at the same time, something about that bothered me. You know, who would know without an obituary online that they even existed in future generations? So I started writing these poems about them with the intention of getting them published. You know, so on one hand, you know, I can honor their wishes, be the dutiful son, but on the other hand, make it possible for people to know that they existed, you know, and the impact that they had on our lives. That's what this chapbook is. And, you know, and also writing these poems, it was a way to keep my parents alive in my life.
Yeah.
You know, and every time I read them, these poems, you know, it's a way to keep them alive in my life and a way to continue honoring them.
Yeah. Did you start writing these poems as they were still alive, or did you start after?
Yeah, you know, that's a very interesting question. With my father, you know, my father and I were not that close. As I said, we were both huge introverts, so we didn't talk much. But no, I knew he loved me, and but talk much. We didn't. I wish we had more of a relationship. But from the moment he got sick, I started writing, and I wrote, you know, a lot about him right away. With my mother, I was very close to. I couldn't write about her right away, and it wasn't because I didn't feel like it was because I was like grieving, and you know, I wasn't a mess after either one of them. I think I for some reason needed some time, and then after a certain amount of time, then the poems came. They started coming, and I'm still writing. Even, you know, this chapbook is done; it's published, and I have a new book coming out in 2022 called Common Grace, and there are other poems in there about my mother and father that are not in this chapbook, and then I'm still writing poems about them, which I like. You know, as I said, it keeps them alive in my life, and I love thinking about them and remembering them. Most of the memories I have are funny memories. You know, they always make me laugh, remembering things they said and did, and which I feel fortunate to have, because I know not everybody has that. You know, nobody's perfect. No parent is perfect. No child is perfect. But I feel very fortunate and blessed to have had Joe and Hama Kimura as my parents.
Since you started at least writing about your father as soon as he fell ill, did you have a chance to show him or your mom some of the poems?
No, I didn't have, you know, by the time I got to my father, I didn't feel comfortable reading him the poem that I was working on. However, I did share with my mother. After my father died, I wrote a poem about my mother and her dealing with my father's death. And I don't know if it was very smart of me. I don't know what, but I did have a chance to read that one to her. She had no reaction to the poem. It was probably not the right time to read it to her.
Yeah. I mean, I think we never know, right? Because as you mentioned, I don't know about your mom, but your father was very introverted and quite a very quiet person. So, you know, as an introvert yourself, you know how many storms we have inside despite not showing it, right?
Yeah, very calm on the outside, turbulent on the inside.
Right, exactly. So I imagine it must have touched her, even if she didn't express it outwardly to you.
That would be nice. That's a nice thought, and I am thankful that I was able to share something that's such a huge part of my life now with her. It is sad that I'm not able to share all this with them, you know. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially since you have such a good, positive relationship, especially with your mom.
Yeah.
I find it interesting, right? If I had not known your name, if I had not seen you, and if I had not read, let's say, the last stanza, I would not have known or had a clue as to the heritage of your parents.
Hmm.
So I was wondering the decision to put in the word, is it Nisei?
Yes, Nisei.
Yeah. Yeah, and your thought process about that.
Yeah, with that word, I purposely, of course, purposely, put that word in there because I wanted to, as a standalone poem, you can gather a lot of things when a poem is in the context of a book, from the other poems. But as a standalone poem, I wanted to give the reader a clue as to my father's background, put him at a certain point in history. When I hear the word Nisei, a Japanese word, which means, refers to a person born in this country of immigrant parents who immigrated from Japan. It puts them in that era of American history where the Japanese Americans were incarcerated, even if they were born citizens. So I wanted to give a little sense of that in the poem. The poem is not about him going to camp, of being incarcerated with his family. It's about his death. But I wanted to give just a little flavor of that. And, many Japanese Americans were in the agricultural world. They were farmers. My father, by profession, was a physical therapist, but he was born and raised on a farm. He told me that my grandfather sired all these children just to work the farm. So I like to say that you can take the boy out of the farm, but you can't take the farm out of the boy. So my father, while he wasn't working, all his free time was spent either in the garden or fishing, but he only fished on the weekends. So he worked our small plot of land, our small lot. We lived in a tract home, so we had maybe like a sixth of an acre. It was very small. He was out there all the time, working the land. He was tied to the land. I sort of wanted to give that flavor, but I guess you also get that flavor with the fact that I say he's a gardener, a Nisei gardener.
I think not to the extent, I would say, of especially his background. So I'm really glad you're enlightening us about that because I didn't know what a pinoak was. I was thinking maybe it was a bonsai or something.
Okay.
And so I wasn't sure of what kind of gardening, because gardening is something that is supposed to be very soothing for people in general, right?
Yeah, my father, we had, as I said, we had a very small lot of land, but half of it was Japanese garden, which my father designed and planted. And the pinoak was part of that. There were 3 large trees in the back towards the fence. There was a pinoak, there was a pine tree, and there was a ginkgo tree. And then the other half sort of evolved over the years. When we first lived there, there were 2 Satsuma plum trees and a Bing cherry tree. And then that area had a swimming pool for many years. And then it turned into a vegetable garden. And it turned into a apple tree orchard. I call it. There's just like 3 apple trees there, small apple trees. But the Japanese garden is what was consistent.
Right. What is a Japanese garden? I'm not really, I don't really know what it is.
I guess when I say Japanese garden, I mean it. He had like lots of moss, rocks, Japanese plants. There was momiji, Japanese maple, which he grew from shrubs. He created these large screens, these structures that partition the garden with these bamboo screens. Very beautiful.
Nice. That sounds incredibly serene. especially now, right, in quarantine. I'm very envious of any just spotting of nature, basically.
Yeah.
Obviously, I have no idea how much contact you have or had with the Japanese American community on the West Coast or on the East Coast. And I personally have, experienced just interactions with Asian American communities, different people from Asian American communities. I mean, we're not all quiet. There are plenty of us who are just loud and obnoxious, like to me. And so I wonder, in your experience, if you feel like perhaps the fact that your father's family was in the internment camps, how that affected his personality.
I don't know if it affected his, base personality, his temperament, but it certainly fashioned his perspective on life. And it's very difficult for me to say because my father hardly ever talked about it. I interviewed him once for a high school essay, and he talked to me a little bit about it. But in that interview, he told me, I can't dwell on this or else I couldn't function. So that told me that it was something very traumatic.
Right.
I didn't know, and I still don't know, a large part of my family, of my, relatives on my father's side. He didn't keep in constant contact with them. I'm not sure why. One of his college friends contacted me a number of years after my father passed away. He was wondering if my father was still alive and wanted to get in touch with him. But he said something like, after being cooped up in the camps with his family, something like that, it was hard for him to still relate to them or something like that. I don't know. It's very mysterious.
Yeah. It's hard to relate, right, when you've never experienced that. Even if you hear stories, survivors who's gone through it, it's like reading a book.
Yeah.
You can empathize to a certain degree, but there is something, that tangible aspect of it you cannot reach.
Right.
But how do you feel about, just growing up, seeing how your parents, live their lives in America, and especially given the resurgence of anti-Asian violence and sentiments, especially because of COVID?
When I think about what my parents endured, my father was in the camps. My mother, although she was born in New Jersey, Bayonne, New Jersey, she was raised in Japan. Her family lived in Brooklyn for like 11 years before they returned in 1939. So during the war, she was in Tokyo.
Oh, wow.
While my dad was in the camps, her home was being firebombed.
Right.
And when I think about what they've endured, it's hard to wrap my head around, but I appreciate them all the more. And I know that I can never know what that feels like, not having lived through it. And I know being born in this country and raised in the generation I was raised in, I'm very spoiled. I just read this very interesting article. I don't know if you saw it in the New York Times by Gish Jen, the novelist, where she talks about the difference of perspective in the generations. Her mother immigrated to the United States in the 40s. And so, that generation, she says, believed that the world was a forest and there were full of bears and there was no forest ranger in that forest to defend you, and you had to take care of yourself and fight for yourself. And mother never assumed that her children would ever be accepted as Americans. But being Americanized, she says, well, I hope there are forest rangers. And I find myself in that in between place too. It's like, I think I'm so influenced by my parents that, I don't expect there to be four strangers out there to understand and help, but I'm certainly hoping there are. And it certainly was true with George Floyd, People came out and made a difference, Fortunately, he had to die for that difference to happen.
Yeah. And all the other people who died around the same time he did.
Not only them, right? Throughout American history,
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that, more recently there are, smartphones or police body cams that show exactly what's going on so that we can see for ourselves rather than just hear it, secondhand. And the frustration that people feel, especially I think with the past year when the protests surrounding George Floyd's death happened, it was like there were 3 deaths basically in a row: Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and I'm terrible with names. The person who I believe was also shot in Georgia, ironically enough. So, and it was just a succession of killings that I feel like just made people realize how incredibly prevalent the problem is. As I have mentioned to you before, I was personally surprised at how incredibly affected I was at the killing of the 8 people really, but 6 of them being Asian American women. My being also Asian American woman, but not because, unfortunately, because I'm sort of used to, a little bit numbed by all of these injustices that I've read about to various communities, Asian American community as well, even before COVID happened. But, it's sort of like what you were saying about how your parents sort of enculturated you or socialized you to expect certain things. And I think in some ways, because of the familiarity with some of these atrocities, that we are our expectations are a bit lower or more adjusted to the realities of what's going on. At the same time, I don't want to be adjusted to that reality. I don't want that reality to be okay.
Right.
And it is to that, and also the resonance I found reading your poem of this idea of wanting to protect our parents as they did us when we were growing up. Just this idea of mutual protection that I wrote my poem, Eliminating Temptations, which I'm going to read now. Eliminating Temptations. I tell my mom not to visit the accountant's office. Rona's run amok, suffocating freedom of movement. A news article said an elderly Asian woman was shoved to the ground. Donald wants Rona to be our fault. The walls of my apartment wrap me like a protective cloak whose porousness emits the chilling draft of side-eye glares. I scrub myself clean of my heritage, but my eyes, my cheeks, my nose tell another story that doesn't allow a really bad day to end in a murder spree. That's for a paler lot than us. Someone told me I'm the wrong shade to opine, then flashed the peace sign because V fingers can scissor away the pangs of exclusionary acts. When I'm standing at the back of the BIPOC line, I tell my mom there's only so much I can do to protect her.
Wow. Nice, well done. And nicely read, too.
Thank you.
Well, there's a lot going on in these 7 couplets.
Yeah.
Powerful.
Thank you.
I figured that you chose this as a response poem because of the parent-child relationship of wanting to protect your parents, especially when they grow older. Am I correct in assuming that Rona is your mother's name?
I've heard Corona being referred to as Rona. It's slang name, especially in the African American community. I've heard that being used.
All right, great. The first thing that strikes me in a poem, I want to get to the content later, but I'm always, I consider myself a maker. I paint, I make poems, and so I'm always curious as to how other poets make their poems. And the first thing, other than the content, that strikes me about your poem is the elimination of punctuation and also its structure and couplets. And, I think the elimination of punctuation works so well here. And I was just wondering, do you usually write without punctuation, or did you choose to do that for this poem specifically?
So I actually started just eliminating punctuations altogether sometime around the middle of last year. And I kind of just haven't really turned back. And in terms of the structure of this poem being couplets, the way I write is I write whatever comes to my mind. And I forget if this one came to me as couplets or if they came to me as a block. I tend to write just a block of text and then format afterwards.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. You're the first person I've come across. I do that too. I just write it as a block, like a prose style, and then I start lineating it. And sometimes it wants to stay a prose poem. Sometimes it wants to be lineated. I don't remember exactly about how this, because this feels like it was composed in couplets. It's just so, the first three stanzas has that puzzle feel about it. Three related couplets, but yet separate ideas.
Yeah.
And of course, without the rhyming word and the repeated word.
Right. Yeah, you're right. I do feel like this was one of those poems. I have a few poems where it comes in a certain form. I always lineate the poems. Sometimes I edit that afterwards, and the line breaks will change. So even if it's a block, it is still lineated. But with this particular poem, I feel like it sort of came in more couplet form. I just let it come the way it does, and then I look at it and I say, oh, okay, it seems like you want to be a couplet poem. Let's go with that and write the rest as couplets.
I think, it's so effective how it flows. You start with this incident in the real physical world. Your mom wants to go to the accountant's office, and then immediately it turns inward toward the speaker's fears and frustrations, and then it goes even deeper to what that means to the speaker, and then finally back to the mother. I think that's an effective flow.
Thank you.
What struck me about the poem sound-wise, even though it's in couplets, the couplets are connected by assonance. I'm wondering if that was something deliberate or it was something that was probably intuitive that happened. First stanza, Rona's run amok, suffocating freedom of movement, the news article. So there's that assonance of move and news that connects the line, and that happens throughout the whole poem, which really strings the couplet along, which I thought was really super nice.
You and I have that musical training in common, because I always started life with musical training. So Yeah. So I feel like the sound of poetry sort of comes as somewhat of a natural, the musicality of it. I do edit. In editing, I'll be like, that sounds off. Let me choose another word. Sometimes I would go as far as counting the syllables. to make it somewhat more consistent. Again, if I see that the poem is going towards a certain direction, I'm kind of just helping it along in some way.
Yes.
So it was not done consciously, but because of that musical training, early formation, I feel like it is ingrained in me.
Yes, it's intuitive now. I hated. What was your instrument?
I did a few things.
Piano?
Piano, violin, singing, guitar, lots of different things.
I was forced to take piano lessons, and I hated them. I took like 8 years of piano lessons, but where poetry is concerned, I'm grateful now, that it is in you, like you said, and so it operates, on a subconscious, intuitive level.
Yeah. My mother was trying to live vicariously through me, basically, by forcing me to take, instrumental lessons.
Yes, I feel your pain. I remember my mother telling me, I always wanted to learn how to play the piano when I was a little girl, and I never had the opportunity, so I wanted to give you this opportunity. How can you fault that?
I have a comeback. I'm just like, do it. You're retired now. Do it.
I said that to her too. Absolutely. And she actually did.
Oh, that's great.
I think it was maybe too late for her, or she didn't have the ability, so she didn't get very far.
Mm-hmm.
But that's so funny. Yeah, then do it.
Yeah.
You do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's hard, right? Especially, again, raised as Asian American children from parents who are either forced to be or are enculturated to identify so strongly with the East Asian culture. There is a sense that you cannot talk back to your parents. But I think both my personality as well as the American enculturation in me has allowed me to kind of, I guess, transcend that. I don't know if that's the word, or break the taboo and be like, just question that a little bit, because I think it is not uniformly applied to everybody.
Do you remember The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan?
Oh, I read that book and saw the movie and loved both. Yeah.
There's that one scene where June takes piano lessons, and she hates them too. And her mother tells her, there are two kinds of girls. There's obedient and disobedient, and there's only one kind of girl who can live in this house.
Well, yeah, I've always been the disobedient one.
Yep.
I think in that there's a lot of friction as well, between the bicultural families or multicultural families, where the children realize that there are more options out there than their parents are telling them. Yeah, there are.
Since we were talking about music, I had another question.
Sure.
about your process when you're writing. When you're writing a poem, do you read it out loud to yourself, or do you hear the music in your head?
I do read it back to myself, but I forget because I'm not as conscious about it. If I'm reading it out loud to myself or just reading it, sounding it out in my head.
Reading out loud.
Yeah, I wonder. I probably do both. Yeah, I think I must do both.
Yeah.
Because it's not the same.
Yeah.
Everybody has their particular way of enunciating things and their cadence. And depending on how you feel as well, every reading is somewhat different. Right.
Right in the middle of the poem, there's this very powerful sentence, which I wanted to ask you about, and maybe you can elaborate on. It's in the fourth stanza, the first line. It says, "I scrub myself clean of my heritage," as if something were dirty or soiled. or something.
Mm-hmm.
That one sentence could probably be 10 more poems, you know?
Mm-hmm.
There's just so much in there. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what's behind that.
Again, as both of us as Asian American people growing up in this country, probably having experienced different, right, but many instances of anti-Asian racism, you begin to protect yourself. At the same time, I also realize as I grow older that there is a sense of self-denial in some ways. This particular line, I would say, is one of those where, even though it just came to me as I was writing this poem, I would say this is one of the least biographical poems.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I do protect my Asian name.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not doing it out of any sense of cleaning it out of my heritage. I do it to protect it because not many people can pronounce it properly. And I don't want it to be pronounced badly. And so it's out of self-protection that a degree of assimilation takes place. And I think I wrote this line both from the interior view as well as from the exterior view of how other people might, specifically the shooter, might have seen me. And also previous to, immediately the day before I wrote this poem was written, I think the shooting was on the 16th, Tuesday. This poem I wrote on the 17th. On the evening of the 16th, I had this really scary experience of someone who acted like he was going to hurt me. My face had been hidden partially, and I think he was looking at me, intently looking at me. I don't know, obviously, for sure, because I didn't actually have direct interactions with him. I was observing him to see what he was doing because he approached me. He was on the other side of the train, and he walked to where I was, and he kept coming around me, and showing me something, a blunt instrument, well, a bottle that he had, like using it to hit his hand. And he's of Asian American background. And I did not know at that point that there happened the shooting. And I have wondered, looking back, if he had known and he was looking for someone to take, revenge on, or what it was. I hope nobody got hurt because of whatever he was doing. I don't know what made him decide to change his mind. It was very last minute, and when I got off at my stop, I kept looking back to see if he might have been following, because he had gotten off the previous stop, very last minute. So that was a very unnerving experience for me. And I don't know if, it subconsciously seeped through into this poem as well. I wrote a separate poem about that experience.
Wow. I carry with me, we've all experienced discrimination, and especially when you're a young kid, you carry all that with you. So I'm always thinking, oh, it's because I'm Asian. When I walk into a new situation, into a room, and everybody looks up at me, I don't think, oh, I'm the new guy, they're looking at me. I think, oh, it's because I'm Asian that they're looking at me. And so, all the things that have been going on, I think twice about going out. That's a very scary thing that happened to you.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I was talking about in the third stanza, right? Is that I haven't gone out as much as I could have gone out. Even given what's going on with coronavirus, I could have gone out safely, gone out at least in terms of health-wise, right? And still kept physical distance from people enough, maybe taken more fresh air, more of nature, and benefited from that, psychologically speaking and physically speaking.
Yeah.
But I haven't really. I've had experienced shunning since the beginning of last year, even before late March, from people who would, weirdly enough, avoid me but go cluster amongst themselves. So I was like, okay, good. You're obviously not the smartest person in the world. Go be with, like, go be in your crowd, I was just like, but still, it is painful, and I am grateful for the fact that I haven't experienced personally. Well, I don't know what the motivations of people are. Some of I've had people react to me differently besides shunning. And because we carry our faith, right? It's not something we can put away, which again goes back to this fourth stanza of I scrub myself clean of my heritage. But my eyes, my cheeks, my nose, even with a mask, people can see
your eyes. Yeah.
And my bone structure. It is very apparent. Which is also ironic because I've interacted a lot with the indigenous community, and there is a lot of crossover in terms of bone structure wise, and I've heard their community tell in open mics and in virtual gatherings that some of them have experienced anti-Asian violence because people thought they were Asian.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Which again just shows how incredibly ignorant the people who perpetrate these sort of violence are. Right? Because, if you can't even target your quote-unquote enemies properly, like, this is just stupidity all around, basically.
Yeah.
So
inane.
Yeah.
Wow.
A lot of inanity.
That the line, I scrub myself clean of my heritage, when I read that, for me, it brought me, everything brings me back to my childhood, but it brought me back to, I was the only Asian kid in my class. My sister and I were the only Asian kids in our school, or so it felt like that. I think maybe there was one or two others in elementary school. And so, as little kids, you want to be accepted by your peers. And so, being Asian, being called names and being, made to feel different and not a part of everything, there's a certain amount of hatred for who you are that kind of develops, or at least in my case it was. I didn't always enjoy being of Japanese descent. Now I love it, but as a kid I didn't, and so if I could have scrubbed myself clean, maybe I would have.
It's very difficult, right? Especially as a kid growing up and experiencing that, and especially if you are in numbers a minority, right? The one or two or a handful of Asian American kids in your class, then you do wonder, because as your child, especially towards puberty or high school, around that time, you want to fit in, you want to be accepted, and this is where we're looking for our identity, right? So it's so difficult.
It really is.
Yeah.
Especially when you start being attracted to other people. I had this crush on this one girl in third grade, and she absolutely did not like the fact that I had a crush on her. So, of course, I'm thinking the first thing, it's because I'm Asian. And that just, whether it was or not, I don't know. But, that really kind of sticks with you.
Yeah. I mean, even now, online dating is something that we basically are forced to do now. And it's also become popular over the past decades. I don't tend to disclose my ethnicity, partly because I'm trying to avoid those, yellow fever people. Because I've run into plenty of those where it's just like, oh yeah, I'm really into Asian women. Just like, oh, you mean you're into whatever's in your head.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
And then on the other side of the coin is that when I finally, quote unquote, reveal my ethnicity, there is a real chance, and I've experienced that, where people tell me I'm not into Asian people. And then I'm like, I mean, I tend to not take it personally because I think of it as them destroying or limiting their own chances of procreation. So I'm just like, whatever. At the same time, it does, no matter what, it still is painful.
Yeah. Yeah. It hits all those notes that have been built up over the years.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's never really had time to heal, right? It's not like everything is hunky-dory now.
Yeah. So I also wanted to ask you, there's another line in the 5th stanza, the 2nd line, that said, someone told me I'm the wrong shade to opine. And I took that to mean that, even in the Asian classification, there are there's Chinese, there's Japanese, there's Indian, there's Korean, where, there's a lot of differences. And if I read that correctly, if that line had to do with, the differences in the Asian classification and what that meant to you.
Yeah, colorism is a real thing, and it's pervasive all around the world, partly because of social economics that existed before colonialism, and partly is reinforced by colonialism. In the case of this particular poem, especially the last third of the poem, it's more about, unfortunately, I've experienced exclusion from other marginalized groups. And I have read even about anti-Asian violence that's been perpetrated by other marginalized groups. I mean, predominantly those anti-Asian violence are being perpetrated by the dominant group, which is European Americans. But there are a minority number that's also being perpetrated by minority groups. And that's true of any sort of intercommunal violence, because I also know of Asian American violence towards, the Black and brown communities. I've actually had arguments with Asian American people I know where they're trying to rationalize away extrajudicial police killings. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm dumbfounded by it because it's just, on principle to me, it's just wrong. It doesn't matter who it's happening to, right?
Right.
And I also know that some of the very few prosecution of police extrajudicial wrongdoing has been met out to officers who belong to marginalized groups. So there are just like layers upon layers upon layers of intersectionality that's going on.
Yeah. So how did you feel after you wrote this poem?
I don't feel a sense of relief. I hate that it really exists. I hate that I had the inspiration to write it.
Yeah.
I'm grateful that it is out there for people to read.
Yeah.
Because this is one of the more personal poems I've written that's also about social causes.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, as I said, I really rather there was no need for its existence.
Yeah. I've been trying to write a poem, and I have jotted down some things, write a poem about these issues we've been talking about in my personal, interaction and experience with them. But it's very difficult. I want to do it for the benefit of the reader. It's very difficult for me to not to be so self-indulgent or portray myself as the victim, which I'm not. I mean, we're all in the same boat, but I thought you did a really great job with this. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I think, again, somewhat going back to the Asian American or Asian culture of the humility aspect, right? That, and then coming to live in America or growing up American, again, one of the friction is the community versus the self. Mm-hmm. And finding a balance that works for us as individuals, again, within a community, either Asian American community or layers of community, Asian American community and then American community as a whole. It is rather difficult, and I think that's probably why I don't tend to write social cause poems that's rooted in the I character.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
So I really, really appreciate that, and I also really appreciated your immediate understanding and comprehension of why I chose this particular poem, because of this common bond of wanting to protect our parents, and our community by extension as well.
Yeah. I'm along with that is, I'm sorry that my parents are gone, but in a way, another part of me is relieved that they're not around to see this.
Yeah. Yeah. I imagine it would have been incredibly trauma-inducing and recalling for them.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today, especially about such personal and painful subjects as both of our poems have been about. Before I let you go, I would love for you to tell us, A, if you know of any virtual open mics you might want to recommend, and B, how people can find you or follow you on, social media or website and such.
I wish I had suggestions for open mics. I only know of my small local ones that I visit now and then. I really haven't participated in any open mics since we locked down.
Yeah.
That's not something that I've done, and it's something that I think maybe I should think about doing. I remember on one of your podcasts somebody mentioned the LA group and the Texas group, and I think I need to check those out.
Yeah, there are many that are online now, so if you feel the desire to go out there, you can safely, virtually.
So yeah, I apologize. I don't have any suggestions, but if anybody wants to find out more about me, I have a website. It's aaronkaisetokimura.com. You just Google my name and it'll show up there. And I'm on social media platforms. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. Again, just Google my name and you will find me.
Great. Well, thank you very much again for your time and for your willingness to chat with me.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I especially appreciate talking about our Asian moms.
And our forced musical jaunts.
But yeah, anytime you need to vent, you know where to find me.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
As always, you can find us at poetsandmuses.com, as well as on Instagram and Twitter under Poets and Muses. You can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter at poetsandmuses.com. Now, in addition to the Poets and Muses website and SoundCloud page, you can also listen to the Poets and Muses podcast on your preferred podcast platforms. I'm your host, Imogen A. Rate. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a safe and healthy week, and I look forward to bringing you another episode next Sunday.